Hi everyone, welcome back to Great Northwest Weaponry. This is Thomas, and today we are talking about the Finnish Mosin M39. This thing is my pride and joy. I love it. This also marks the end of our kind of ongoing series on Finnish Mosins. There will be kind of branching off of this Russian Mosin videos as well, because there's a lot to look into with the old garbage rod, as the older ones are called, or more specifically the Russian ones. This is decidedly not a garbage rod. This thing is nice. This is the Ferrari of Mosin Nagants. It is gorgeous. It shoots so nice. This bolt is just so smooth. It's... A lot of people tout this as the best version of the Mosin that exists. Those that argue it would argue that the 2830 is superior. That argument is largely because the most prolific killer on Earth, Simo Haya, used a 2830 for pretty much his entire time in the Finnish army. But all things considered, this is a quality rifle. Let's go ahead and go into the gun room and talk about some history. So here it is, everyone, the end of the road. We are wrapping up our series on Finnish Mosins. I am both relieved and saddened by this. Not gonna lie, a lot of research went into this, a lot of time on my part, but I've got to shoot a lot of awesome guns to do this video. Only this one of which being mine of the three that we've looked at so far. And yeah. I can't think of a better way to end it, honestly. This gun is fantastic. I may sound like I'm a bit of a like a fangirl of this, and I would be lying if I said I wasn't. These are marvelous guns. But as with the previous videos, we're actually going to be starting talking about what came before the M39, which would be the 2830. So, and to talk about the 2830, we're going to be touching a bit on stuff that we talked about in the last video, namely the end of the run of the Finnish Civil Guard's M28s. So they knew that they could improve the design further, and in 1930 they started working on this, and the M28 would be made until 1932, but starting in about 1933, you'd start seeing M2830s popping up. The M2830 had a couple of major differences, largely involving the sights. And the sights on this are actually closer, on this M39, are closer to the M2830 sights than the M28 is. So it would have a rear sight, almost just like this one. There would be one minor difference that we'll look at later. And the front sight, instead of a hole where you adjust the front sight post with a punch, now you've got... like a screw that you can just use a screwdriver or like a penny or a knife blade to just turn this piece here and move it side to side. We'll look at that right now in the box. Behold, a screw. So those would be your biggest differences. The front end would look much the same on a 2830. And these guns, a lot of people, as I don't know if I've already mentioned it, but the 2830 is sometimes regarded as the most accurate of them all. It could be argued if it's that or this. There are definitely things about the M39 that I would say are straight up improvements over the 2830, but you know, who am I? Simo Haya used the 2830 to kill over 500 enemy Russians, so... And if we ever get a 2830, we'll be, I think I've already mentioned this long ago, actually, when we were talking about the Karkano M38. But if we ever get a 2830, we will be diving into Simo Haya's story, especially since it will fall outside of this series, and we've already kind of covered the how that gun came to be. But essentially, you had 40,000 2830s total. About 24,400 of those were manufactured as 2830s, still off of old, mostly Russian receivers. Still the only way that you can tell when receiver, who made the receiver and when, generally, is if you pull the receiver out of the gun, and it'll sometimes be marked underneath. But especially since the both on the 2830 and the 39, if there were other markings, namely if there was an Imperial Russian Eagle stamped like right here in the case of this one, this has it, and we'll look closer at this later, but they'd grind it off. So if it was Russian, that was usually a pretty easy way to identify it. So this, I would say, had an M91 receiver, and they ground off the Imperial Russian Eagle. But, so, back to the 2830. 40,000 total. About 24,400 were manufactured as 2830s. I'm starting to talk faster than my brain is thinking. About 15,600 were 28s that were upgraded to 2830s. Usually this upgrade would just be a straight sights upgrade. A lot of times on 2830s, you will see something that is done across the board on 39s, which would be the two-piece stock. This was largely just to strengthen the front end because of problems with mostly the M27, but also the M28, which was basically the stock cracking apart if you use the bayonet in any, be it training or combat. Though, side note about Finnish bayonets, we don't actually have one. It's a blade-style bayonet. It looks like a boot knife, more or less. And they generally did not affix the bayonet to their rifle. They did not do that very often at all. If they used the bayonet, it was usually right up close and personal, and they just wielded it as a fighting knife, more often than not. But anyway, so the M2830 was a very lauded rifle, and for good reason. Like I say, you've got Simo Haya used it in 1937, I believe it was, when the World Rifle Championships were held in Helsinki. The 2830 used by one of the Finnish participants was the overall winner of that competition. And that specifically is why the M39 became the standard across the board, because the 2830 was made for the Civil Guard. They were used by the Army. Generally, almost all Finnish Civil Guard weaponry wound up in the Army's hands at some point or another. We've talked about that before as well. And if it has an SA stamp, that's a pretty clear indicator that it did wind up in the hands of the Army, either at some point during the Winter War, or more likely in the War of Continuation or the Continuation War. All of which, again, we've kind of gone over this, but it is all important, because the Army was still using the M27, and they used that clear up until they replaced, not replaced so much as standardized on the M39. So the M39 was meant to replace the M27 and the 2830 and be an across-the-board upgrade. Every complaint that anybody had about either design was addressed here. So the upgrades that had already been made to the 2830 were largely kept, namely the sight, the both front and rear, the now easier to adjust front sight, and the entirely remodeled rear sight. The rear sight was adjusted to have a 150 meter zero on the M39. I believe it's a 200 yard zero on the 2830, but they decided that they didn't want you have to consciously aim low if you were shooting within 200 yards, of which was very common, particularly in the type of fighting that was happening in Russia. And before, even during the Winter War, fighting fairly up close was pretty common. And these pretty much were introduced as a result of the Winter War, more or less. The Winter War was ongoing when you first started seeing them popping up. This one is dated 1942, so the Winter War would have been over. And you won't see much dated much earlier than this. But this was, like I say, it was kind of the universal, this is what we're standardizing on, and it was so well done that in some cases the Finns didn't even let go of these until the year 2000. That's when the last of their arsenals were liquidated, their surplus of these M39s. So you have a couple of other implements. You may remember in the previous video when we talked about the latching barrel band or nose cap on the M27. This, the M39, features that, and the barrel is now standardized. So you would have, we touched on this a bit in the past, but barrels across the M24, M27, M28, and even the 2830 could vary wildly. So sometimes you'd have an original Russian barrel that was just counterbored to fix a pre-existing problem, or a sleeve that was put into a barrel. The 27 and the 28 were different just because the Civil Guard thought that they could make a better rifle than the Army could, so they just didn't use the same style of barreling as the Army. Plus, you had multiple companies from multiple countries making the barrels up to that point. When you get to the M39, you're mostly going to see Sako and Tikakoski, or Tika, for the barrels. This one is a Sako. You can actually see a large marking over here, and there's a marking on the barrel as well that we will take a look at later. But also the swivels on these, and again, all of this stuff we'll largely be looking at when we get to the tabletop again. But the swivels were upgraded. Most of it you'll see on this side, but you can on the bottom see the hangers. But there's also on the side, there's another swivel and a indented into the stock hook. So you could carry it either way, depending on what your preferred configuration was, or depending on what the standard was for your unit. So the Civil Guard might carry it on the sides, where the Army might carry it on the bottom, for instance. I don't know if that's absolutely correct, but that is just as an example. So a lot of these were made. This is the most common variant of the Finnish Mosin, as we've been referring to it fairly loosely. 96,800, roughly, were made from 1940 to 1945, with a few thousand more being made as late as 1970. Like I say, this gun was held on to for quite a while, and again, with how much of a fan I am of this rifle, I can't blame them. Though you would think that they would have went to something, you know, semi-automatic, a little more modern by the 70s. And they were, mind you, but they were still making these in limited numbers. I believe the end total was 102,000 something. It may have just been straight up 102,000. But yeah, like I say, you've got the two-piece stock. And this is something, the two-piece stock on these, you'll see it's kind of a tongue and groove type of thing, where it's attached on the bottom, and on the side you'll just see a line going through. But on the bottom, you'll see primarily 3 variations of the bottom of that. So this one, it's rounded on the bottom. You'll also see like a spiked or squared off. By my understanding, rounded is early. Spiked is like middle of the war, and squared would usually be a post-war replacement. So if you have one that's like 1942 dated, but it's got the tongue and grooves are square, then it, excuse me, was more than likely restocked at some point, and it could have really been any time. Like I say, they kept making these until the 70s, so why wouldn't they restock it if they needed to? But nice to have an early stock on my particular example. There are a lot of really cool things about this. There's one interesting thing that you'll see this on Russian and Finnish, primarily just Russian and Finnish, but you'll also see it on some other guns. But the wood has this really crazy tiger striping on this example. You won't see this on all of them, but it is somewhat common to see. And from what I've understood, this is because of the weather, really. Because in Finland, in winter, it freezes so hard that it'll stunt the growth of trees. And that causes these dark stripes where the grains are more condensed, because the tree is trying to grow. It's still getting water and in some cases sunshine, but it's too cold for the wood to expand and to grow further. So it causes a compression of the grains, leaving these dark stripes. And this gun, like on the top handguard, they're extensive. But the biggest upgrade, I would say, in an M39 is this semi-pistol grip. On every example up to this point, you would have the straight stock. And that semi-pistol grip is really comfortable to hold, makes the gun a little more stable feeling in your hands. They thickened the front end on both the 2830 and the 39, at least the 2830s that were manufactured as a 2830. You wouldn't see that particular improvement on a converted M28, for instance, of which, if I'm not mistaken, Simo Haya's rifle was a converted M28. So it was an M28 that had been given the 2830 sights. But this forend was thickened to reduce the likelihood of a split occurring. It was thickened substantially, in fact, and as was really all the way through. This gun is pretty beefy feeling in your hands. If you have small hands, this might actually be uncomfortable. You might prefer the older variant for just how it feels in your hands. Or not. I don't know. I haven't had small hands since I was a child. So, yeah, there's a lot of awesomeness on this. Like I say, I am a true fan of this rifle. I think it was the natural conclusion to the Mosin design. If you were going to keep making Mosins, you had to end on something this good. So let's go ahead and transition to the tabletop and look at some markings and some of these features we've been talking about a little more closely. We're going to try and make this part kind of quick, as this video is already getting really pretty long. So you can see on the site, there's that 1.5, so 150 meters. Here's your Sako stamp, 1942. And we talked about barrel bands, so there is one more thing here. This here spring style release for the barrel band is something that was added on this design as well. Previously they'd been using Russian style barrel band attachment here. And going on with the sling attachments, you've got, there's your attachment on the side and bottom there. And that pretty much covers all the little things we'd mentioned. You could probably already see, but got some big Sako stamps on the receiver of this, which is kind of nice. Bolt extraction is still a piece of cake. Open the bolt, pull the trigger, pull the bolt the rest of the way out. Pull the trigger, reinsert the bolt. You can still release everything within by pulling down on that latch there and opening your magazine. So if you have any serious jams, you can fix it that way. So yeah, that's pretty much all she wrote. Let's go ahead and take this out for the final shooting segment. So again, and for the, I believe, third time now, we're going to be looking at how to load a Mosin gun. If you don't know how to do this at this point, I really, I apologize, because I'm clearly either doing something wrong or you're not paying attention. You insert the clip, 5-round clip, take the front one, hold it up a little bit, and push down with your knuckles. And that should keep them all in line if you lined up the rims correctly in here so that they're not overlapping. You do not want the top rim behind the bottom rim, or it will lock when you do that. The safety, just like all the others, works just like so. Virtually all Mosins of the Finnish varieties are based off of older receivers. I've not heard of a single instance where, be it Tikka or Sako like this one, actually made a receiver. There's a way to get to the receivers. We've probably talked about it a few times over the course of the series, but the only way to know for sure who made the receiver is to take it all the way out of the stock. But anyway, safety is now off. We're gonna go ahead and go through this last 5 here. I love this thing. I really do. This is quickly becoming one of my favorite rifles that I own hands down. I would actually really like to go hunting with this thing sometime. It is a bear, and it is pretty stinking accurate, even when firing fairly quick. And even that's one thing too with this. I've talked about rim lock in a lot of videos. I had rim lock on the third shot on this. The rim was locked, and it still is just so smooth. I was able to just, with just a little bit of added force, unlock it and keep on going. It's just, I really can't say enough good about this. If you have the ability to get a Mosin Nagant M39, do it. They are worth every cent. So anyways, like I said, this concludes our series on straight demos of, at least in this series, of the Finnish Mosins. If we ever get our hands on a M27 or 2830 or I'm trying to think if there even is another one that we're missing. I think that's it. That's the only two that we haven't covered. If we ever get our hands on one of those, we'll maybe revisit it. Maybe some of these will come up in versus videos in the future. But in the meantime, I hope you have enjoyed up to this point. This has been Thomas with Great Northwest Weaponry, and we will see you next time.